Square 2, the King's Palace Part 3 is knitted separately and sewn to the cast-off edge of Square 1 Sumptuous. So you are sewing together stitches along the cast-off edge of Square 1 to rows along the side or selvage edge of Square 2. A knitted stitch in most structures is not square, it is wider than it is longer. So you are sewing together 45 stitches to 62 rows. This means that you are going to have to ease the two pieces of fabric together. I'm going to use mattress stitch to sew the two squares together, and I'm going to set up a sequence which will mean that the two pieces are seamed together evenly. The sequence is as follows. So one stitch to one row, one stitch to one row, one stitch to two rows. I've placed markers along both edges, placed approximately at thirds across the work, placed as evenly as possible. These markers will be points at which, if any amendments need to be made, if any extra easing is needed, these are the points at which I will do it to bring the two pieces of fabric into line. They're almost like checkpoints for when you're seaming them together. I'm going to use some lighter coloured pieces of fabric to show you the technique of sewing them together, because it's going to be easier for you to see where I'm putting the needle against lighter coloured yarns. Starting on the lower edge, so this will be Square 1 Sumptuous with the cast off edge here, and Square 2, the King's Palace, with the selvage edge here, the cast on here and the cast off here. I'm going to take the needle first of all under one whole stitch just under the cast off edge here. Now one whole stitch is the equivalent of 2 legs. So I'm going to begin with the needle at the back of the work coming into the front underneath the very first whole stitch. I'm just underneath the cast off edge. I'm then going to take the needle under one row along the selvage edge of Square 2. Now I'm just going to turn the fabric on its side so you can see more easily where these bars are. I'm sliding the needle to show you a bar between the edge stitch here and the second stitch in here. There is a bar for every row. There's 2 bars there, so that's 2 rows. So I'm going to take the needle under the very first bar I can find, which is just below the cast off edge here. That's the first bar. I'm going to bring the yarn through. I'm going back to Square 1, the cast off edge, and taking the needle back into the same gap where the yarn came out of and under the next whole stitch. Then I'm going to take the needle back into the same gap along the selvage edge where the yarn came out before and under the next bar, the next row. I'm taking my needle under the next stitch, so that's 2 bars or 2 legs, and then under into the same gap and under 2 bars this time along the selvage edge. You can pause and pull firmly but gently on both ends of your sewing up yarn just to close the seam. And if we look at this now, we've completed one whole sequence, which is to take the needle under one whole stitch, one row, one whole stitch, one row, 1 whole stitch, 2 rows, and that is the sequence that we are repeating all the way from the beginning to the end of the seam. So just to repeat that sequence again, it's needle into the same gap where the yarn last came out from, and under 2 legs or bars, that is 1 whole stitch, into the same gap along the selvage edge where the yarn last came out of, and under 1 bar, under 1 stitch, under 1 bar, under 1 stitch, under 2 bars to complete the sequence. Again, you can pause and pull on both ends to tighten the seam. So you continue in this way all the way along the 2 pieces of fabric until you reach the end. When you come to the markers, just check that the fabrics are matching up on both sides. If necessary, do any easing in on the selvage edge and not on the cast off edge. So keep the cast off edge under 1 stitch all the way along. But if you have to ease at those 2 points, take the needle under an extra or 1 less bar just to ease the fabric so that the 2 pieces are matching up perfectly. I've used a brightly coloured yarn here to sew up so you can see what I'm doing more easily. However, on your squares, you need to use one of 2 yarns, I would say, either the Tanzanite or the Garnet to do your sewing up. I would go for one of these 2 as you begin square 2 with Garnet and you finish with Tanzanite. So that's the reason I would choose one of those 2 to do the sewing up. You can't actually see the yarn when you're sewing up. When it's finished, you can't see the orange here, for example. It's an invisible seam. But I would still probably use Garnet or Tanzanite rather than a brightly coloured yarn to sew up. Turning it over here, you can see what the wrong side of the work looks like. You've got the cast off edge and the very edge stitch taken into the seam.